In my previous video reviewing the 7800 X3D with RPS-C3, the PlayStation 3 emulator, you may recall that with the exception of overclocking my memory, all my tests were done on the stock settings, and while the results were pretty good, there were certain games that struggled with enhancements. Well, I missed something that a YouTube user was quick to point out in the comment section, and it was the fact that my GPU could be the cause of certain performance hits. After reviewing my footage, they were definitely on the money. While the GPU usage wasn't hitting 100%, it still affects the frame rate. The GPU doesn't work the same with RPCS3 the way that it works with PC games, and from what I understand, 50 to 70% can be considered too high. So after learning about this, I downscaled all the titles that were taking performance hits, and while it didn't quite make everything better, there were definitely improvements. Killzone 3 in particular seems to really require a lot of usage from the GPU, and so I've decided that I'm going to leave it out of this video and possibly revisit that game when I upgrade my GPU. So let's get to the main topic of this video, Precision Boost Overdrive. Precision Boost Overdrive, or PBO for short, is an overclocking feature created by AMD that uses an algorithm to adjust settings that you would normally have to do manually. For people like myself, it definitely makes overclocking much easier, and more importantly, it's safer to do. It is also recommended that you turn this feature on through the BIOS, and depending on your motherboard, the location of this setting is going to vary. So without further delay, let's get into some results. Starting with Army of Two 40th Day, you may recall that this struggled with keeping a consistent frame rate. With PBO disabled, we can see that while you're getting an average of 60 frames per second, the minimum FPS is around 53 frames per second, and the 1% low is at 58 frames per second, so not too bad. Enabling PBO, however, definitely shows an improvement, with the minimum FPS now coming in at 59 frames per second, while the 1% lows are hitting 58 frames per second. Now let's take a look at the two titles that ran at 120 frames per second. On Wipeout HD, there was an average FPS of 118 with the minimum FPS sitting at 100 and the 1% load floating around 97 to 98 frames per second. With PBO turned on, there were some slight improvements. While the average FPS stays the same, the minimum FPS is now coming in at 106 and 1% lows float around 99 to 100 frames per second. On to Drinking Guard 3, where with PBO disabled, the average FPS stays at 120, the minimum FPS hits 98 frames per second, and the 1% lows stay at 117 frames per second. Enabling PBO has a loss instead of a gain, with the 1% low showing at 94 frames per second. So as you can see, there are slight improvements in certain games, but not by a very wide margin. Now, I could have just ended the testing there, but the manufacturer of my motherboard, Gigabyte, has their own feature known as PBO Enhanced. What the specific option allows you to do is choose profiles that include a preferred temperature and what is known as a curve optimizer. Each level of the curve optimizer essentially increases your CPU's frequency. I personally decided to set mine to a recommended option of 80 level 2, and so here are those results. Once again, starting with Army of Two 40th Day, nothing has changed when it's come to frame rates. Next up is Wipeout HD, and well, it's not looking so good, with the minimum FPS dropping to 83 frames per second and the 1% low going down to 90 frames per second. What about Drinking Guard 3? Quite strange as the minimum frame rate goes up to 102 frames per second, but the 1% goes down to 111 frames per second. So there only seems to be one improvement, and it wasn't a very big one at that. There are some obvious benefits to having PBO enabled, but as you can see, it's not a huge boost in performance. I would definitely recommend that you keep an eye on your temps if you want to use this feature, making sure they don't go over the recommended threshold, which to my recollection was 80%. For more details on PBO, I will leave a link to Skater Bencher, who gets into much more details when it comes to overclocking. If you found the information in this video to be helpful, please give it a like. For now, this is Decor, your entertainment techie, signing out.